Hey everyone, and welcome back to Flutter From Scratch. In today's video, we'll have a look at how we can use Flutter Bloc and Hive to create a to-do app that has individual logins for various users. And normally that's something you'd like to happen online. You'd like a user to register, then log in, and then maybe save their to-dos to the cloud, right? But there are times when you would prefer to keep this data local to the device. And it also makes it easier for us to create a sample app today, because we only have to save the to-dos to the device without persisting them to anywhere like Firebase, for instance. Now, in some of my last videos, it was pretty hard to see what was going on. The font size was small and it was kind of blurry, so I've tried to fix that in today's video by making everything a little bit bigger. So today, we'll be creating an app that starts with our login screen. If the user wants to, they can register and create a new account. We'll use Flutter Bloc for our state management, and we'll use Hive to persist the data to our device. And if you know how to manage the state in your app, and also how to persist data in a reliable way, you'll be surprised how many apps you can create. Our app today may not look very good, but that's because we're focusing on how to manage our state using Bloc and how to persist the data using Hive. We're more into that than we are our general look and feel. But of course, you could pull a project down yourself and try and pretty it up yourself. Okay, let's make a start on making our to-do app. So again, I'm just starting here with a pristine Flutter project, and we'll go ahead, hop into our pub spec, and we'll add our dependencies within Flutter Bloc, equatable. We'll also be using Hive to persist our data to our device. And to do that, we'll need to bring around our own dependencies for this. So we need Hive, Hive Flutter, Hive Generator, and Build Runner. So I will just go ahead and I will grab Hive, Flutter, and then coming down to our dev dependencies, after Flutter tests, I'll add the Hive Generator and our Build Runner, and I'll run pub-get. So because this is a sample, I'm not really going to be choosing any particular versions that I would like, because by not specifying them, I'll just get the latest available. But obviously for production code, you should set the ones that you would like to use. So today we'll be making a basic to-do app that a user can log into. So the first thing we'll do is we'll come into our main.dart file, and this is just a basic placeholder that we get whenever we create a new Flutter project. And we'll delete everything from about line 38, 39 down. I'll create a new folder, and I'll call it home. Within here, I'll create our actual home screen. I'll have it in Git, that's fine. And I'll create a new directory for our block. Finally, we'll create a block class for this. Call it home, tick the equator box, and then just hit OK. So because our app runs entirely offline, we don't really have that much to do within this block. We can come into our state, and we can have our home initial state, which is just a state that's going to be shown when the app first loads. What I'll do though is I'll add a boolean to here for success, and then I'll hit the light bulb and add the constructor for that as well, and I'll also add it to our equatable check. The reason for this is because the user will come to our app, they'll try to log in, and they might be successful, but if they're not, we should tell them that's the case and show a little message. So our state's pretty simple. The app is loaded. We'll also make this boolean optional, because when the app first loads, it won't be specified because the user hasn't tried to log in just yet. I'll also add a question mark here to this, which will fix that issue. Next up, we'll hop into the home event. And thinking about the events for our page, we pretty much would like to account for what to do when the user attempts to log in. So I'll create a new event here, class login event, extends home event. I'll hover over login event and inherit the things it would like us to. And I'll add a string for the username, and also add it for the password. Hover over these, add these to the constructor, and we'll also add them to the equatable check down here. So that's the state. And the event pretty much figured out for now. So we'll go ahead and we'll hop into our block, and we'll just get rid of the default handler here. Now, coming into our block, we can see I've actually made a mistake, because we have a little underline here underneath our home initial. The reason why this has this little red squiggly line here is because within our home initial, which I'll just click on, I've said that I've always need this parameter, this success parameter, to always be defined. And we're not going to know what the case is when we first open the app because the user hasn't even tried to yet. So I'll just add the curly brackets either side within the constructor, and then I'll save that. And then if I come back to the block here, we can see that it goes away. If I come into here and just press Control Space, we can see that we can set the success variable, but by putting it in curly brackets, I've essentially made it a name parameter. But for now, that's not what we'd like to do. So now we've done that, we can go ahead and we can take account of what to do for our login event. So our login event here depends on functionality that we don't have just yet. We'd like the user to come along, enter in their details, and then see if they can log into the app or not. To do that, we'll need a way to persist the data to the user's device to track the user's to-do items and also track who can log in and who can't. So let's go ahead and create that functionality now. Within the lib folder, I'll create a new directory. I'll call it services. I'll create another new Dart file in there, and I'll just call it authentication. Class authentication. I'll also create another directory called model, and then within that model directory, I'll create another Dart file and I'll call it user. So class user. And I'll go final string username, final string password. Now, for very good security reasons, you shouldn't normally store a password in plain text in your application. You should hash the password and then compare the hash instead. But that's kind of out of scope for today's video. I'm just saying don't get this code and put it into production because you'll have people very unhappy with you in the long run. For now though, I'll go ahead, I'll hover over this, and I'll add the constructive parameter to that as well. So what we have here is a very simple object that looks like it can contain a username and password for our user. So this is the thing that we'd like to persist to the device using Hive. So above it, we'll just add the Hive type annotation, and this will prompt us for a type ID. Hive internally uses identifiers to work out what database is accessing. So in this case, we'll set it to 1. If you're working on a Flutter app and you create a Hive object and assign it a type ID, don't change it after you've set it and you release the production app, because if you do, it'll probably create a world of trouble for yourself. The same thing applies to these fields here. Go ahead and we'll go Hive field, and we'll specify a type, and we'll specify an index of 0 because it's the first field. Same thing applies here for the next field as well. I'll go ahead and I'll save that. So now what we'll do is we'll hop into here as well and we'll create another Dart file and we'll call it task. And these will be the tasks that the user has got on our list. So we'll say final string user, just get the name of the user, final string task, which would be the description of the task, and then it'll also be obviously if it's completed or not. Hover over these, bring in the things that we need, and do the same annotations for here. Add a Hive type ID 2, because the other one was 1, and also add a Hive field 0, 1, 2. The next thing we need to do is we need to come at the top of this file and put in the part task.g.dart and semicolon. Now that just seems strange because the file doesn't even exist, and why are we using the part directive here? Well, we're essentially setting it up for what comes next. When we run the build runner, what will happen is it will actually generate the data adapters that we need to add and remove data from this. We'll do the same thing within the user Dart file as well. Part user.g.dart semicolon. So now if we switch to our terminal, we should be able to run flutter packages pub run build runner build. That's really long, I can never remember it, I always just Google it. So after that, it's now completed, and we can see the little red lines have gone away from our task and user files here. If we come back into here, we see that we have 2 new files. And if we click into it, we can see that it's created a type adapter that'll house all the details for our particular object. So now, let's leverage this functionality within our service layer to create and log in as users, and also to handle our to-do list. So we come into our authentication.dart file that we created before. Up the top here, I'll add in a new function, and it will be a future, and that will return the name of the user that we're authenticating as. Add a parameter for the username and also for the password that we're currently using. I'll also add another feature up here which will return nothing, which will just be an initialization function. And within it, what we'll do is we'll set up our Hive boxes and we'll get everything ready. The first thing we need to do is we need to register our adapter for the user adapter. And that's just the code that we generated before. And we'll save that. I'll add async to that as well. We'll also add in a box for our users here, and we'll just call it users, and we'll make it private by putting the underscore in the front. And then we'll assign this users object by going await hive open box user, and we'll specify a name. So just users box is fine, and semicolon. Last thing we need to do is make it asynchronous, so hover over this await, add the async. We'll also need to mark this users variable here as late, because we can't assign it at the same time as when we set up this authentication service. I'll also add service at the end of that class there actually. So finally, we can work out if there is a successful login by typing in the users box, getting the values from that box, and then using the any function to work out if any of the elements within this box match a certain condition. So we want to know if any of them match the username we've been passed, and also if any of them match the password we've been passed. Now, if it's successful, if we find a user that has that username and that password, so if success is true, then we'd like to return that username back up to the calling function because that's the person that's trying to log in. Otherwise, we'd like to return null because we checked and we couldn't find any user by that name. To do that, I'll hover over here and I'll have to make the return type nullable, which will just make it a string with a question mark on the end. That's pretty much our authentication service figured out. So the next service we'll need to configure will be for our to-dos, and I'll call that to-do service, and I'll also specify an asynchronous initialization function for this as well. And that'll just be for Hive to first register the adapter for the task adapter. We'll also need to specify a box, which will be defined later, to contain the tasks themselves. Once we have that, we can simply assign that task variable to open the box with the type of task, and we'll just call that box tasks. Await on the front of there, and that's Hive configured. So we'd like to get a list of tasks from this, and to do that, we'll say get tasks for a certain user. And that's just as simple as accessing a task box, getting the values, and getting all of the tasks out of the box where the user is equal to the username that we've been passed. Then we'll just return this back up to the calling function. Actually, because there's no asynchronous code within this get task function, we can make the return type just a list of type task, and we'll save that. Also add another function here to add a task, and that will just add to our tasks box a new task, the username, the task that it is, and false, because the user hasn't had a chance to complete it yet. So our service here is to add a task and also get the tasks that are on the list itself. The final function we'll add will be to remove a task, so the user can remove it if they so wish to. Final string, the task to look for, the username, or the person who added it. Now, because we're modifying things within this Hive box, we'll actually have to go back to our original declaration, and we'll have to make our original objects within Hive extend from the Hive object. This just gives a little bit of extra functionality, like being able to know the key of that object within Hive, which is pretty handy. And we'll do the same thing for our user class as well. So after we've done that, we'll come back to our to-do here, into our remove task service. So we'll look that up. Task to remove equals tasks values first where element dot task equals task, and the username equals the username as well. And once we've done this, Because these tasks now extend from Hive object, we can actually just call task to remove and call the delete function on it. This is actually asynchronous, so call a wait on that and then make this function asynchronous as well. The last thing we'll add is a function for people to update the tasks if they so choose to. And then we'll set the completed as optional, so we can update to say if the task is completed or not. Open bracket, and once again, and we'll just go ahead and we'll pluck out the exact task we'd like to edit as well. Then we'll access where the index of this key is by going key, and we'll cast that to an integer, and then we'll call the tasks box, and we'll call a put operation on the index, and within there we'll specify the task object, which will just be the task that's passed in, which will be the username, the task itself, and if we have the completed variable set, we'll use that. Otherwise, we'll just use whatever the value of it already is. Here we call put to update the existing values within the Hive box. This is actually a feature as well, so I'll call a wait on that, hover over, and make it asynchronous. And in doing that, we've actually configured both our to-do service class, and we've also configured our authentication service class as well. So I'll just close some of these tabs up here, and now we can get to actually implementing some of the UI. So going back to our main here, so we'll go ahead and we'll open up the home file that we created a little while ago, and within here, we'll just create a stateless widget for our login page. This will look pretty plain, that's kind of the intent. We're sort of focusing on Bloc and Hive here, not really what it looks like. The first thing we'll have is we'll set up a column, and within our column, we'll have a text field, and our text field will have a decoration, input decoration, and it'll just be like label text, and it'll just be username. And we'll save that. We'll also have a password field here, and we would also tell it to obscure the text, which we would like to do in the case of a password. Finally, we'll just add a elevator button with a blank onPress function for now, with login on it. Come back into our main.dart, and if we tell our app to load our login page first, and finally within our login page, we'll just wrap all this with a scaffold. We'll change the child to body and give it an app title, give it the app bar title, text, because it can have anything there. Log into to-do app. We'll save that. We'll hit the go button. Now, we're not going to have an app that works just yet, but we've made enough that we can actually build the app and finally get hot reload going so we can see what's going on as we make changes. And here we have a very boring looking application. We have a username field, a password field, we type into it, things go in, hit login, nothing happens because we haven't wired up any of those details just yet. So the next thing to do is basically to come into here, and above our column here, because we'd like to use the block pattern, we can hit the light bulb, and we can actually wrap this whole thing with our block provider. So we can call this home block, and then we can just import that block in. And just for consistency, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to rename this login page to home page, so we get better consistency between home page and home block, so we don't confuse ourselves. If we hover over our block provider here, we could then import the library for block, and then underneath this block provider, within this column, we'd like to wrap this with a block builder. So home block, home state. So now, because we have access to our builder within our block builder, we can check if the state is home initial, which it always will be because it's the one state that we have. And we'll just go ahead and we'll move all this up into this part. Now, after this first type check, we'll go down to here and we'll just add to return a blank container. And it might seem kind of strange, but what's actually happening is if our state matches the home initial state, which it always will because that's the only state we have, then we'd like to show these columns with text fields in it. But after this if condition completes, you could possibly return null from this function. So that's why we return an empty container in case it doesn't match. So now with that all done, we'll go ahead, within our onPress function here, we want to first locate the block that we have registered. So to do that, we'll access the home block here, and then we'll add our login event. Now, login event will be our username and our password. So we can see here we have two text fields, and we want to get the text value from them. To do that, we just need to define a couple of text controllers that we can associate these things to. So we'll say username field, we'll call it a text editing controller. And we'll also set up another one for our password field, equals text editing controller. We'll come back down into our text fields here, and we'll set up our controllers for our username field and also for our password field. Finally, with that, we can now pass in the contents of these, so username field dot text and also the password field dot text. And I'll put a comma there and save that. We'll just check the data analysis. By default, we normally get a const constructor for these, but we can't use it anymore because of setting up new variables in the status widget. So we're good to remove that. And also I'll check the other error. Oh yeah, which is const as well. So we can remove that from there as well, because these aren't constant values anymore. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll access the block, and I'll just add in here to print our event, and I'll save that. And after adding that print statement, we can now hop in, put some details in here, and hit login, and we should see the events come through into our block as we would expect. So that means the events are coming through and we're printing the results out, which is really good. So now what we'll do is we'll create a reference to our authentication service within here, and then we'll hover over this and add it as a dependency within this block. And we'll make this event asynchronous. We'll attempt to authenticate this user with the credentials that they've given. So within our block here, after I remove that print event, we need to go ahead and we need to register this login event to see if a user has logged in or not. And to do that, we have a dependency here on our authentication service. Now, the way that dependencies or services work within Flutter Block is different to anything that I had used before I came to Flutter or the block pattern. Within our main.dart, I have here the material app. And what we need to do is we need to bring in a multi-repository provider above the material app. So it's a really complicated concept, so I'm going to try and illustrate it to you just very briefly. So basically, in every framework that I used before I came to Flutter, normally you would have your dependency injection container. And within this container, you would tell the dependency injection how you would like to construct your services. Now you have a service to handle authentication, another service for databases, and so on and so forth. Then later on within your code, you would maybe have your database service, and then within the constructor, you would specify the dependencies that you would like to resolve out of DI. When whatever you were using try to instantiate this object, it would go back to the DI container and it would construct these services based on how you told it you would like these services constructed. At least while using Flutter Block, you don't really have a dependency injection mechanism per se. Instead, what you have is you have a thing called a repository provider. And what happens, this repository provider sits up normally very close to the root of your application. Then, widgets underneath it, like your block builder for instance, access this repository provider by calling the repository provider, and that's normally .of, and then the 6 steps, type arguments. What the repository provider does is it goes all the way back up the widget tree until it finds a repository provider that can provide that specific service. It sounds complicated, but let's see how it works. So armed with that knowledge, we're going to go ahead and we're just going to wrap this. So we need a multi-repository provider. We need to specify our providers. And this is the part where we specify how we should construct our services. So we'll go repository provider, and we'll have our create argument come up there, and we'll just go to context, and then an arrow into the authentication service. So if we think about it like this, what's going to happen is we'll have our app start up. At the absolute beginning of our app, we'll have this multi-repository provider, and then we'll have our material app, and then our various widgets that define how our app looks. No matter where we are within our app, no matter how deep we are within that widget tree, we'll always be able to search back up through our widget tree to find the service that we're requesting when we call the repository provider function elsewhere. So this is how we create our services. And if we go ahead and have a look at the block for the home screen, we can see that within the home block, we have referred to this service here. We're standing up a reference to it, and we've specified it in the constructor. But the way we actually resolve it within the UI for our application, we can see that when we've created the home block, we've specified that we'd like to resolve the authentication service. You would think searching back up the widget tree, trying to find the service that you're after, would be a computationally intensive operation and would cause some jank within your app. But I've certainly never experienced it, and it happens extremely quickly. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and hop back into our block here. And because we have our service reference set up correctly, within our event handler for our login event, we can now go and look for a user that matches the details that we've specified. So event.username, event.password, and we'll save that. And if there is a user that matches that, then we will, and if there is a user that matches that, then we'll want to have a successful login state. Actually, while I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this success property because we don't actually use it. So we just created our successful login state, which I'll hover over and create the overrides, and I'll just replace that with an empty list. And I'll just specify here the username that was successful. Now, this isn't how you create an application that's going out to production, but for a learning exercise, it just helps you see how it goes all together. So we'll hop back into our block, and what we're going to do is that if we found a user that has these details, that has this username and this password, then we'll omit the successful login state with the username that was returned from this function. So we've checked if the user exists, and in this case, it seems like they do. So because they do exist, we'd now like to load the screen that has all the users' to-dos on it. We haven't created it yet though. So in the lib folder here, I'll create a new directory, I'll call it to-dos, and I will create a new block directory as well. The first thing I'll do will be the to-dos.dart file, which will be our UI of course. Right click, new block class, and we'll call it to-dos. Tick quotable. Okay. So again, thinking about the states and the events we would need for this. So we'd need an event to load the to-dos, and we'd need a state to show those to-dos. So within our state here, I'll just declare a to-dos loaded state, which extends the to-dos state. And I'll accept all the overrides, place that with an empty list. In the event as well, class load to-dos event extends to-dos event. So within our state, declare a list for the tasks, and I'll add it as a constructor parameter, and I'll also add it to the property that we'd like to check for equality. So we have our event which loads the to-dos, and then we have a state to show that the to-dos are loaded. So within our block, I'll remove this to-dos event on the load to-dos event, and we're handling the load to-dos event here. So we'll just dive back into this event real quick, and we will add here, as well as this, the username for the to-dos that we'd like to load. Create constructor, I'll add it to the properties as well. So within the block now, we also want to bring in a dependency here on our to-do service. And I'll bring that in for our block. And we'll just go ahead and we'll retrieve those to-dos from that service. So event, username. Now with all the to-dos loaded, just go ahead and we'll yield that up into our UI. So our event comes in to load the to-dos, and the state that comes out of it is a to-dos loaded state. Within our block, we're just responding to this load to-dos event. We're using the service to get the tasks or to-dos, and then we're emitting a new state with those to-dos loaded. So we'll come back into our to-dos here. So we'll create a stateless widget, which will be called our to-dos page, and I'll import from widgets, and I'll wrap the container in a block provider, which will be our to-dos block, and we'll tell it where it can find that service, the to-dos service. So to-dos service, and then we'll also wrap our container here in our
block builder. So it'll be our to-dos block and our to-do state. By default, we return a container in case none of the states match, and I'll just leave that there so we're not returning null from this builder process. But if the state is to-dos loaded, then we'll return a list view, and the children in this list view will just be the tasks that we have. And we'll just map these to a list tile. A list tile is just a really easy way of showing these things. And I'll make the title text, and it'll be the task, and we'll also convert it to a list as well. And in the trailing, we'll also specify a checkbox, and the value of the checkbox will be whether it's completed or not. And we'll just add an onChanged argument for now as well. For now, I'll leave the onChanged event alone as we cover how we can update our to-dos in the next video. The last thing we'll need to do within our todos.dart is we'll need to go ahead and wrap our block provider with a scaffold. And we'll add an app bar to this. It'll just be a normal app bar, title, text, to-do list, and we'll save that. We'll change child to body, and that should be all we need to do. Our to-dos page will also only ever be called with the string of a username whose tasks we're trying to load. So I'll add a parameter for that, and I'll also add it to the constructor. Into our block here, I'll add the event to load the to-dos for that user that's been passed in the constructor. And that'll be 2 dots there actually. And I'll add in the load to-dos event for the username that we have specified. Now what I'll do is just within our authentication service is I'll add some code to this init function. I'll actually create the users that we would like to have for our account. So we'll call it test user1, and I'll make their password password. And we'll also add another user called Flutter From Scratch, and we'll also call it password. We'll also hop into the to-do service, and with the init function here, we'll add a task. User will just be test user1, task will be subscribe to Flutter From Scratch, and it'll be complete, and it'll be true. We'll add another task for our other user. This really is just placeholder code, just to test at this point, and just to sort of see how it'll all look. I'll just go ahead and I'll add a wait to this as well. And just for testing purposes, I'll clear the box first so we don't get more and more on subsequent loads. We'll also go ahead and we'll add a wait to the front of these statements. And just for now, for testing purposes, I'll clear that box before we do anything. One problem we have though is that we have our init function here for our authentication and our to-do services, but the setup for these services is actually asynchronous. And if we come into our main.dart, we can see that all this code here is synchronous. We can't effectively call asynchronous code from synchronous code here, so we'll need to do something to make sure this works right. We'll also add in a second service, which is our to-do service, and we'll save that as well. While we're in our main.dart, I also need to come into here, and then I need to call await Hive init Flutter. Save that. So we know that we can't call asynchronous initialization functions from within our synchronous function. So the way that I overcome this, and there's probably a few ways to do this, is that within the first widget that I have for this page, in this case that's the home page, I can see here that I'm building this based on if the home initial state is set to this. I set up a column and some input fields as we've seen. So what I do is I use an event within this block to perform the service registration, and when it's complete, I yield the state. Let me show you what I mean. So within our state, we have here our home initial and our successful login state within our code. I'll create a third state and I'll call it registering services state. And it will also extend our home state. Create an override for that, and it won't have any properties from this state. So within the home block, I'll also add a reference to our to-do service, and I'll add it to our constructor as well. Now we'll hop into the events for this, call the register services event, and we'll also extend the home event. Add our overrides, replace it with an empty list. So within our home block, we'll respond to this register services event. And we'll make it asynchronous because it calls asynchronous code. And we'll await our authentication, call init on that. We'll also call init on our. Now when that's completed, we can now yield our home initial state. The last thing we need to do is we need to change the initial state of this block from home initial to registering services state. So when the app loads up, we know that initially it's trying to register the services. Finally, we'll come into our home.dart and we can see that we also need to supply the repository provider for our to-do service. And I'll just add a comment on the end so it formats correctly. So for this home block, when we create it, we want to send into it the register services event immediately. So our block loads up, gets the register services event, registers our services, and then yields the home initial state. Because they've been initialized, they can now be used by the rest of the application. So we'll now come across into a home block, and we can see the last thing that we did is we emitted our successful login state back up into the block. So what we need to do now is we need to respond to this state, and we need to carry out a navigation action. So we need to navigate from where we are now over to the actual list of to-dos. After we emit our successful login state, we also want to reset our block to the home initial state to cater for any subsequent login requests. You can see how we have a block builder here. Well, a block builder has one function. It builds a new UI state if the current state of the application changes. But we actually want to change it to a block consumer. And what a block consumer gives us, it gives us a builder, but it also gives us a listener, which has the same parameter as the builder. And with the listener, we can say that if the state is successful login state, then we would like to navigate to-dos page. And we'll have to give the name of the user that logged in. So we'll log into our app, and we can see we have our single task here. Clicking the box doesn't do anything just yet, and we'll have a look at that in the next video. If I log out of there and replace the test user 1 and hit login, we can see that we have that list as well. And effectively with Flutter Block, we've created a very basic to-do app that doesn't do much just yet. So thanks for tuning in today. In part 2 of this video, we'll have a look at how we can edit existing tasks and how we can add new ones as well. But for now, that should be enough for you to understand how you can use Hive and Flutter Block to persist data within your application and also manage state. I hope to see you next time on part 2 of this video.